All right, let's dive in. Today we're taking a deep dive into Karl Popper. He's a big name in 20th century philosophy, especially philosophy of science.
Yeah, definitely a major figure.
And I know you're a philosopher yourself, so this should be right up your alley.
Looking forward to it.
We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy all about Popper.
Excellent source.
So we'll explore his ideas about science, his critiques of Marxism and psychoanalysis, even that wild three worlds theory he came up with.
Lot to cover there.
Definitely. Let's start with what shaped his thinking. What were some of those big influences that kind of set him on this path?
Well, early on, Popper had some, really intense run-ins with Marxism and psychoanalysis.
Ah, those are some weighty topics.
They definitely left a mark on him.
I bet. Those are the kinds of things that make you really question what you believe.
Absolutely. What really struck Popper was this, stark contrast he saw between those theories and, say, Einstein's theory of relativity.
Okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
He was blown away by Einstein's work, right? Because it was testable, like you could actually try to prove it wrong.
So Einstein was putting it all out there, risking being proven wrong.
Exactly. But when Popper looked at Marxism and psychoanalysis, he felt like they lacked that vulnerability.
No, interesting.
It seemed like no matter what happened in the world, their followers could always just twist the evidence to fit their existing framework.
They weren't really open to being wrong, huh?
Not really. And, that brings us to what Popper is most famous for, that idea of falsifiability.
Ah, yes, falsifiability, the big one. So that's the idea that for a theory to be truly scientific, it has to be possible to disprove it, right? Like through experiments or observation.
Exactly. It might seem simple, but Popper's insight was revolutionary.
Yeah, I can see that. It challenges that, like a traditional way of thinking about science, just gathering evidence to like prop up a theory.
Totally. He flipped the script, argued that real scientific progress comes from actively trying to disprove your theories, not just confirm them.
Okay, so instead of searching for evidence that supports our favorite theory,
Right.
we should be looking for that one piece of data that could completely dismantle it.
You got it.
That's kind of a wild way to think about science.
It is. It's like embracing the possibility of being wrong.
So can you give me an example? Something a philosopher like me can really wrap my head around.
Sure. Let's take the law of conservation of energy.
Okay, yeah, energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed.
Right. Now imagine someone builds a perpetual motion machine.
Whoa, hold on. Like a machine that just keeps going and going, creating energy out of nothing.
Exactly. If that happened, it would completely shatter that fundamental law.
Wow. Okay, I see your point. So even our most cherished theories, the ones we think are rock solid,
Yeah.
they need to be constantly challenged, put to the test. But how do we actually test these, like, massive universal theories? Where do we even start?
That's where basic statements come in.
Basic statement.
Yeah. These are specific, observable claims that can clash with those big theories.
Okay, so they're like the building blocks of scientific testing, right? The concrete data points we can use to see if our assumptions hold up.
Exactly. Think of them as the evidence we gather from the world.
Grounded in, like, real observations and experiences.
Exactly. Specific claims like there's an X at Y, the kind of observations that could potentially disprove a universal theory.
Okay, I'm with you. But how do we know if those basic statements are even true in the first place? Observations can be subjective, right?
You're right. Popper knew that was a tricky issue.
Because our own biases, our interpretations, they all come into play.
For sure. So Popper argued that scientists, they reach an agreement on those basic statements through a process of convention, kind of like a jury deciding a verdict.
A jury. That's an interesting analogy.
Right. Just like a jury weighs the evidence and makes a decision, scientists, they come together, look at the observations, and decide which basic statements are true.
So it's not just about what one person sees or thinks. It's about building a consensus, using the best evidence we have to really test those theories.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, always evolving, always refining our understanding of the world.
Which I guess leads us to our next question. How does knowledge actually grow, according to Popper? Is it just like piling up more facts and more data?
Nope. Popper saw knowledge as this, ever-changing thing, always moving forward through problem solving.
Okay, so it's not just about, like, memorizing a bunch of stuff?
No, it's about constantly challenging those assumptions, searching for deeper explanations. And he had this four-step process for how scientific progress happens.
Ooh, I love a good framework. Lay it on me.
All right, so first, you got to have a problem, a question that needs answering.
Right, got to start somewhere.
Then you propose a theory, a possible solution to that problem.
Got it.
Next, rigorous testing. You do everything you can to find flaws in your theory.
So you're really trying to break it.
Exactly. And finally, based on those tests, new problems pop up, which leads to better theories.
So it's a never-ending cycle of questioning, testing, refining. Sounds exhausting.
It can be, but also incredibly exciting.
I can see that. always pushing the boundaries of what we know.
Right. And within this framework, Popper introduces this really fascinating concept called verisimilitude.
Verisimilitude. Okay, that's a fancy word. What does it mean?
Basically, it means closeness to the truth.
Closeness. So, not just true or false.
Right. Popper argued that even if a theory is proven wrong, it can still be closer to the truth than another theory.
So even when we're wrong, we can still be moving in the right direction.
Exactly. He believed that we're always striving for a more accurate understanding of the world, even if we never reach absolute certainty.
I like that. Kind of a hopeful way to look at things, especially in fields like philosophy, right? Where there's so much interpretation, so much debate about what's true.
Absolutely. It reminds us that it's not about finding the answer, but about continually improving our understanding.
Okay, we've covered falsification, basic statements, the growth of knowledge, even verisimilitude. What about this three worlds theory? I'm intrigued.
All right, now things are about to get really interesting. It's Popper's take on ontology, the study of what exists. He said there are three distinct worlds.
Three worlds. Okay, I'm all ears.
First, there's world one, the physical world. Stars, rocks, trees, all the tangible stuff.
Makes sense.
And then there's world two, the world of mental states. Thoughts, feelings, beliefs, all that's happening in our minds.
Okay, two down. What's the third one?
The third one's where things get really mind-bending. It's world three, the world of human-made ideas and theories, a realm of objective knowledge.
So world three is like a separate world of pure ideas, like existing outside our minds in the physical world.
Precisely. It's where things like scientific theories, mathematical concepts, works of art, even ethical principles, they all exist objectively.
Wow, that's a big one. I bet that ruffled some feathers in the philosophy world. He's saying knowledge, in its purest form, exists outside of us.
That's exactly what he's saying. It challenges how we normally think about knowledge and reality. But Popper's argument is that these World 3 objects, they have a real impact on the other two worlds.
Okay, so how does that work? Give me an example.
Think about Michelangelo's David. The statue, it physically exists in World 1, right? Carved out of marble.
Right?
But it's also a product of Michelangelo's mind, his thoughts, his creativity, which are part of World 2.
Okay.
However, the artistic idea itself, what the David represents, it goes beyond the marble and even Michelangelo's mind.
So it exists in World 3.
Exactly. It has this objective existence in World 3, inspiring people for centuries.
That's a powerful image. It makes you think about all the great works of art, literature, scientific theories. They all seem to take on a life of their own.
Exactly. They become part of that World 3, shaping our world in amazing ways.
Okay, so we've got knowledge existing objectively outside our minds. That's a pretty radical concept. But how did Popper apply this to understanding society and history?
Well, that's where things get even more fascinating. So Popper, he really believed that to understand history and society, you got to understand the people, the individuals who make it all happen. He was like totally against this thing called historicism.
Historicism. Remind me what that is again?
It's that idea that like history follows a predetermined path. Like there are these grand laws that dictate the future.
Ah, right. So it's like we're all just along for the ride, no free will or anything.
Exactly. And Popper, he was like, nope, not buying it. He thought history is shaped by choices, by the actions that people make, not by some, mysterious force.
So no grand plan.
No grand plan. He saw any attempt to predict the future or to plan society based on some blueprint as not only wrong, but potentially really dangerous.
Dangerous. How so?
Well, Popper had seen these totalitarian regimes rise up, and to him, that kind of historicist thinking, it was a slippery slope to that kind of authoritarianism.
I can see that. If you think you know how history's going to unfold,
Right.
you might think you have the right to force everyone to follow your vision.
Exactly. It can be used to justify some really scary stuff.
Yikes, like the ends justify the means kind of thing.
Right. And Popper, he believed those grand schemes, they just ignore how complex humans are, how unpredictable our actions can be. He thought the best way to improve society was through what he called piecemeal social engineering.
Piecemeal social engineering. That sounds a lot less intense.
It is. It's about tackling specific problems one by one instead of trying to completely overhaul society based on some utopia.
Okay, so it's more about taking things step by step, making small changes.
Yeah. Testing solutions, seeing what works, learning from mistakes.
So it's kind of like that scientific approach, but applied to social change.
Exactly. Trial and error, constantly testing your ideas against reality.
It's fascinating how he ties those principles of science to, how we make society better.
Yeah, it's all about critical thinking, open debate, always questioning assumptions. That's why he was such a big fan of the open society.
Open society. Meaning?
A society where people can think freely, speak their minds, criticize ideas. freedom of thought and all that.
It makes sense, especially considering what he lived through, right? The rise of fascism, World War II.
Absolutely. Those experiences, they really shaped his whole philosophy. He saw firsthand how fragile freedom is, how important it is to protect those open democratic values.
It's a good reminder for us, too. Even when things seem stable, we can't get complacent.
Right. We got to keep questioning, keep challenging the status quo. Otherwise, it's easy to fall for those simple solutions, those temptations towards authoritarianism.
Well said. It's about recognizing that there's always more to learn, that we should never be afraid to, like, rock the boat a little.
Exactly. Building a better world takes constant work, constant dialogue.
This is pretty heavy stuff, but I gotta say, it's also inspiring. Popper's ideas, they give us a way to understand not just the world,
Yeah.
but also how we can actually make a difference in it.
They do. His work is a powerful testament to critical thinking, being humble about what we know, and having faith in our ability to reason.
Okay, so we've explored Popper's big ideas, that concept of falsification, his three worlds, his views on society and history. But I'm guessing not everyone was totally on board with all of this, right?
Oh, for sure. Popper was a bit of a controversial figure. He challenged a lot of conventional wisdom.
So what were some of the critiques people had of his work? I'm curious to hear what the other side had to say.
Well, one of the main challenges came from people who questioned whether those basic statements can ever be truly objective.
Right, those basic statements, the foundation of his whole system.
Yeah. Critics said, look, if all our observations are filtered through what we already know and believe,
Right.
can we ever be sure we're seeing the world as it really is?
It's that classic problem of subjectivity. How do we know if what we're seeing is really out there,
Yeah,
or just a product of our own biases?
exactly. And if those basic statements are shaky, then the whole idea of falsification becomes a lot more complicated.
Because you're building on a foundation that might not be solid.
Right. They argued that scientists don't always just throw out a theory when it faces contradictory evidence.
They try to tweak it, refine it.
Exactly. They adjust their assumptions, or those auxiliary hypotheses, as Popper called them.
So in practice, it's not as neat and clean as Popper makes it sound.
Yeah, it's messy. Critics pointed to tons of examples where theories survived even when they had problems, even when they didn't explain everything perfectly.
Like Newtonian physics, it worked for centuries, even though it couldn't explain everything about, say, the orbit of Mercury.
Exactly. It took Einstein's theory of relativity to provide a more complete picture.
Right, but Newtonian physics is still useful for a lot of things.
Exactly. It's not just a matter of true or false. It's more about how accurate a theory is and what it can be used for.
Okay, I see that. And it makes me think about those historical critiques of Marxism and psychoanalysis. Did those arguments hold up under scrutiny?
Well, those were especially controversial. And they're still debated today. Some people said that Popper didn't really represent Marx's views accurately.
They're saying he kind of created a straw man argument.
Kind of. They pointed out that Marx himself was against utopian planning, and he valued empirical evidence.
So maybe Popper oversimplified things a bit.
Maybe. But others said even if Marx's original ideas were testable in theory,
Right.
his followers often just twisted things to protect those theories from criticism, exactly the kind of dogmatic thinking Popper warned about.
It's like they were trying to force reality to fit their beliefs.
Exactly. And this whole debate about Marxism, it connects to a bigger question. Can the social sciences ever be truly scientific, like physics or chemistry?
Right, because society is messy and humans are unpredictable. It's hard to do those controlled experiments you can do in a lab.
Exactly. That's a major challenge for social sciences. How do you study something as complex as human behavior?
And then there's that pushback against his critique of psychoanalysis, right?
Oh, yeah. Lots of debate there, too. Some folks said Popper just didn't get psychoanalysis.
Like he of missing the nuances.
Exactly. They said Freud himself was open to revising his theories based on what he observed.
No, not quite the rigid dogmatist Popper made him out to be.
Right. But then others countered that, sure, Freud might have talked about empirical testing.
Yeah.
But in practice, those psychoanalytic interpretations were so flexible they could explain almost anything.
Like that old joke, right? The psychoanalyst says, whatever comes to mind, just say it, except elephants. And then the patient immediately starts talking about elephants.
Exactly. It shows how easy it is to find what you're looking for, even if it's not really there. And that's a problem for any field dealing with subjective stuff, like the human mind.
So it all comes down to this question. What counts as good scientific evidence, especially when you're dealing with something as mysterious as the mind?
You nailed it. And that question is still being debated in psychology and philosophy of science today.
It makes you wonder what Popper would think about neuroscience. Trying to understand the mind by studying the brain.
Interesting question. I bet he'd be intrigued by how neuroscience brings more hard data to the study of the mind. But I also think he'd be cautious about reducing the mind to just brain activity.
Right, because there's still that element of consciousness, of subjective experience.
Exactly. Even as we learn more about the brain, the mind remains this fascinating puzzle.
Like peeling back layers of an onion, always another one underneath.
That's the beauty of intellectual exploration. It never really ends, and Popper's ideas, they keep pushing us to think critically about the world.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring Popper's main ideas, the critiques, those controversies.
A whirlwind tour through the mind of a truly influential thinker.
It has been. But before we wrap up this deep dive into Karl Popper, I want to bring it back to you, our listener. You're a philosopher yourself. So I'm curious, as a philosopher, how do you see these big ideas, like that idea of falsifiability, playing out in philosophy itself?
That's what's so cool about Popper, right? His ideas, especially falsifiability, they can totally apply to philosophical theories, too.
It's true. We usually think of falsifiability in science, but philosophical theories, they can get pretty abstract.
Totally. Sometimes it feels like philosophy is just floating out there, disconnected from real-world evidence.
Exactly. It's like, how do you even test a theory about consciousness or the meaning of life? It's not like you can run an experiment.
Right. It makes you wonder, can philosophical theories be designed to be falsifiable, even just in principle? Can we find ways to connect those abstract ideas to the world so they can actually be challenged?
That's a really interesting question to think about. Makes me want to look at my own work, see if I can apply those Potterian principles, make it more rigorous.
It's a challenge for all philosophers, I think. How do we make sure our ideas aren't just like intellectual castles in the air? How do we ground them in reality?
Right, they need to be connected to the world, to those messy lived experiences.
And that's what's so great about Popper. He pushes us to question our assumptions, to look for those potential weak spots, to be okay with being wrong.
To be humble and open to new ideas.
Exactly.
Well, I think we've given our listener a lot to think about today. We've covered Popper's core ideas, falsification, the three worlds, and even some of those criticisms.
Yeah, we've really explored the legacy of his work.
And, anyone who can spark this much debate and discussion decades later, they've definitely tapped into something important.
For sure. His work really gets to the heart of how we understand the world and our place in it.
To our listener, if you're interested in exploring more, Popper wrote a ton. There's so much out there to discover.
And who knows, maybe you'll even find ways to apply his thinking to your own philosophical work, or even challenge some of his ideas. That's the beauty of philosophy. It's an ongoing conversation.
Always questioning, always refining our understanding.
And Karl Popper, he definitely shaped that conversation in a big way.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Karl Popper. We hope you found it insightful, maybe even a little mind-bending.
Keep those minds open, keep questioning, and keep exploring.
And hey, maybe try to falsify a theory or two along the way. You never know what you might find.